As a Necro main in Diablo 2, one of the most common requests for 2.4 builds has been the Bone Necromancer, since there was a buff to the synergies for several of its skills. So the question is, most commonly, is there a noticeable difference for the build? Now, to test this, I did restrict myself from using Corpse Explosion, though for optimal playstyle, you would use it to clean up crowds, especially in stuff like cows. This is mostly because I wanted to test just how much of a difference the change itself makes. As far as it making a difference, I would say yes and no. There is a mildly noticeable bump in the damage output from skills, but overall the feel of the build is about the same as old reliable Bone Necromancer that I'll often recommend as the easiest hardcore starter character in the game, just due to its sheer safety. The weirdly biggest change that I find impacting it isn't even the character change, but rather the change to one rune word: Insight. Basically, now that it can be put into bows, I have far less mercenary stress than before, since the rogue is much easier to keep away from swarms of enemies, since she won't hug my bone walls like Wahid does and get cut by things that have longer than one range. Now, all that said, the Bone Necro is still one of the cheapest post-game characters at least, so it does work out to his advantage, with the only expensive bits being entirely optional or swappable for something similar. For example, on the 2.4 Rogue, I'm using the new Wisdom runeword on the helmet for piercing and cannot be frozen, and an Insight bow as mentioned earlier, both fairly cheap. For the armor, I am using Fortitude here, but it is just a fairly optional selection. Even something like a Duress would be perfectly fine for her since you're using her for the meditation and sometimes a bit of help against magic immunes. On ourselves, we're basically using plus skills and faster cast spam. That is our main goal. And there are a few options for this, but the quick and easy standard is a white wand with a natural plus to bone spear. And while this one was found in Hell, you can shop +3 bone spear wands from Act 2 Drognin and normal. I'm currently pairing that with a homunculus for the boost and resists and skills it can provide. And due to being only an exceptional unique, it's a lot easier to farm early than other Necro head options. That said, you could go with some alternatives, such as a Spirit Shield instead of the Homunculus if you need the faster cast. You do lose some resist with it, but it's still a solid shield and a lot more reliable to get, even if it does take more strength, and even if you have to get to Hell difficulty to find the base for it. An expensive weapon option is also Heart of the Oak, which does get better faster cast than white as well as resists, but is a lot more expensive and does cost you quite a few plus skills and even potential non-investment skills like we have with Confuse on our wand. In terms of the not weapon swap expensive stuff, you've got Enigma. I use this a lot for positioning with this build and is a definite quality of life booster, though as is the rule for these guides, I don't use it to skip mobs, so it is possible to use the build without teleport as a factor. And if you do need it, grabbing a teleport amulet with plus necro skills or a teleport staff on swap will do just fine. It's just a few more button presses comparatively. Even cheaper alternatives like Viper Magi or even Stealth for a super budget are just fine with this build. On the head, I'm using Harlequin Crest, mostly for the plus skills, but the Magic Find is not bad either. The reality is, even just a random +2 Necro Circlet would work just fine, or something like a Peasant Crown or Lore on the budget end, as we've said in the budget guide. Yeah, it would just be fine here too. As expected, our jewelry is going to be plus skills if we can get it. Dual Stone of Jordan and a +2 Necrocaster Amulet. Obviously, this is a super expensive version, and the stones aren't super cheap either, but you can easily swap that out for a more normal plus skills amulet and a dual faster cast rings. Though do check your faster cast rate tables whenever you're adjusting your faster casts, because they are listed over on Amazon Basin, just to make sure you're hitting the right amounts. Since if you've hit a breakpoint, it may be better to go for resist on some of these faster cast sources rather than just going for just more faster casts with no purpose. That said, boots and gloves are pretty standard caster fare. In this case, Trangul's gloves for faster cast rate, and, well, the curse boosts are nice too, and War Travelers for a bit of magic find. Again, resist boots would be fine, or even mana boots can be solid as well, since there's a few options there for that just in uniques and even rares. And lastly, we have the belt, which is Arachnid Mesh for plus skills and faster cast, which is generally just, as we said, the theme of the build, which you could replace with a crafted caster belt for some faster casts as your ideal budget swap, and caster belts can actually get you some decent resists on your belt as well. Charm-wise, it's plus skills all the way. Torch, Fungal Charms, and Annihilus being the obvious picks if you have them, but all they do is speed up the process. They don't make or break the build's functionality, so you can kind of just go with whatever charms you want if you can't get these. Now, why did we leave stats and skills to the end? Well, mostly because I'm just experimenting with formats, but also because, frankly, they're super freaking simple to do. Since for stats, it's straight up enough strength and dexterity for your chosen gear, which is much lower if you go homunculus and a wand, and then just dump the rest into vitality. For skills, there's a few things you can do, but the most important thing is that pretty much all of your skill points are going into Bone Spear and its synergies. Spirit is okay for some circumstances, but Spear is still the superior skill. Not because it's overpowered, but more just that Spirit doesn't do enough extra damage to justify the extra cost comparatively. The order of investment I usually go in is Max Spear being the priority, followed by Spirit, and then the Bone Walls and Prisons to augment my Bone Armor cast, and finally at the very end, Teeth with whatever spare points I have left over. And when leveling up, I usually just save my points for the 1-point wonders and for pumping Bone Wall segments of the synergy on Spear until I hit level 18. Usually it's a little past that because you can only put so many into Spear, so you just dump the extras into Wall. The support skills you can use, but are not always mandatory on Bonemancer, are from common to least common Corpse Explosion, because it speeds up crowd clearing and, well, it's a prerequisite, you're going to have it anyway, Clay Golem, as well as Mastery and Resist for a buddy that slows bosses, Blind and Decrepify as strong utility skills to control different types of enemies, Blind for ranged, and Decrepify for blind immune enemies and Corpse Explosion buff if you don't want to juggle it with Amp. And then there's the ones I did not invest in, which sometimes I do, but on this one I just didn't. And that's 1-point Wandering Skeletons or Confuse for more crowd control options. And they're not bad since you're already packing a bunch of plus skills, so you can turn these into much bigger things. Overall, I still like the build, and I still think it's a great option for a starter build both in hardcore and softcore. It will struggle a little for the first 12 to 18 levels while you get up to its key skills, but this is areas where you can just use whatever you find on the ground and use bone armor to survive. But after that, which you'll usually see by Act 2 normal, you'll have almost nothing really be able to stop your slow, steady progress into the end game. As far as post-game builds, it's safe, but nowhere near as fast as the more aggressive builds like Fishymancers, Lazy Bones, or Commanders.